about the low IQs and the dumb behavior and the bad decisions. Right away they start talking about education. That's the big answer to everything. Education. They said we need more money for education. We need more books, more teachers, more classrooms, more schools. We need more testing for the kids. You say to them, well, you know, we've tried all of that and the kids still can't pass the test. They say, don't you worry about that. We're going to lower the passing grades. And that's what they do in a lot of these schools now. They lower the passing grades so more kids can pass. More kids pass, the school looks good, everybody's happy, the IQ of the country slips another 2 or 3 points, and pretty soon all you'll need to get into college is a fucking pencil. Got a pencil? Get the fuck in there, it's physics.
Yo, what up? I'm Tony, a grad student at NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, and today we're talking federal policy in education, specifically the No Child Left Behind Act. I'll start by providing some historical context, then discuss 4 hallmark features of NCLB and major criticisms, implications, and ramifications surrounding those features, and end with my final thoughts. Let's get into it.
In 1957, the Russians beat America to space with their Sputnik satellite, and this triggered a national conversation and anxiety in the United States among political leaders and the public. The conversation centered around what it meant that this other nation could outperform America, and that was the start of a conversation about American schools and if they were preparing kids to compete on the global stage. America's worldwide dominance and position as a global superpower was under threat, and the resulting near hysteria provided an opportunity for school reformers to demand more investments in both education programs and in new approaches to teaching and learning. The federal government's response was a slew of legislation that addressed education and school reform so that 1 year later, in 1958, Congress would approve $1 billion for the National Defense Education Act. But most scholars agree that the most significant piece of legislation addressing education and school reform would come 7 years later with the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which supplied the first federal dollars for pre-collegiate education with a laser focus on high-poverty schools. It also required reauthorization every 5 years.
This is actually a really important piece of legislation, federal legislation around public schooling in our country. And the reason is because prior to 1965, the federal government didn't really have a deep investment strategy or a targeted investment strategy for public education. And so in important ways, ESEA really established the federal government's role in public education funding in the country. It was passed under President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration as part of the War on Poverty, and it really was the largest and most comprehensive education law or piece of legislation that the federal government has ever passed relative to public education in our country. In that respect, even though the reauthorizations are significant, like IASA, like the No Child Left Behind Act, the kind of meat and bones of what is in all of these different reauthorizations starts with this original piece of legislation. And what it did was very simple, actually. It provided targeted resources to particular populations, students of color, disadvantaged students, disabled students, poor students. And basically, the federal government said, our role in legislating and funding public education is going to be around sending resources, particularly for those populations, wherever they go to school. So this piece of legislation in 1965 was landmark and critical in that it defined in important ways federal intervention and federal funding in public education in the United States.
Although the government was responding to the growing apprehension around the efficacy of U.S. public schools, a sense of anxiety around the education levels of American children in relation to the rest of the world only continued to boil in the 1980s with the rise of Japan and the rise of China. It is in this social and political context that A Nation at Risk was promulgated.
The Nation at Risk report really caused all of us to take a hard look in the mirror and understand how much work we had to do with our students. And it was really a clarion call for action.
How did A Nation at Risk come about? This is back to the early 1980s, the early Reagan administration. The U.S. Secretary of Education at the time, Ted Bell, said, we need to get a blue ribbon group together to take stock of how we're doing as a country in education. And by 1983, they had come up with this blockbuster of a report.
It got a lot of attention because of the language that it used to emphasize the seriousness of the concern about educational performance. It was on the front page of the New York Times, for instance.
A Nation at Risk was a report that really was a wake-up call for our country.
A Nation at Risk called out the poor performance of American students.
We were woefully short of having our young people prepared to meet the requirements of the century.
A Nation at Risk was really using a sort of national competitiveness argument, really made the case that our underperformance in education was a threat to the nation.
It produced a real buzz, and then it spread.
It really kicked off a whole new era of state and federal involvement in education policy.
It motivated reform efforts all around the country that live on to this day.
There's a lot of energy in this, and it kept going for a surprisingly long time.
We just reviewed the historical context surrounding the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act, and next I'll discuss 4 hallmark features of NCLB and some of the major criticisms, implications, or ramifications surrounding them. NCLB was trying to ensure that schools and districts met certain academic thresholds and did this through a series of increased accountability measures, including, for example, stricter requirements to access federal Title I funding. And this is a big deal because schools are funded primarily by their state and local property taxes, rendering the education children receive intrinsically unequal. To counterbalance this inequality, the federal government issues Title I funding to financially support schools that have a high percentage of children from low-income families, according to EcoEd, an online academic resource founded by Dr. Deanna Filippi. So basically, the law said to districts and schools in all these 50 states, if you want your Title I funding, you need to meet these specific requirements, including but not limited to identifying measurable adequate yearly progress. According to legal scholar Andrew Lee, in an article entitled "What is No Child Left Behind" for Understood.org, states had to bring all students, including those in special education, up to the proficient level on tests. They had to set targets for improvements called Adequate Yearly Progress, or AYP. Schools essentially got a report card from the state on how they were performing, and the school had to share that information with the parent of their students. AYP was determined through annual testing, another measure meant to bolster increased accountability. According to No Child Left Behind, Past, Present, and Future by William Hayes, the new law mandated that schools were to administer federally approved tests in language arts and math in grades 3 through 8. And the test scores had to be reported in 8 different subgroups. If schools did not achieve their adequate yearly progress as determined by annual testing, there were a series of penalties for each subsequent year AYP was not attained. The final and perhaps most significant component of NCLB's increased accountability tactics surround teacher qualification. According to Allison Klein's 2015 No Child Left Behind, an overview for Education Week, all new teachers hired with federal Title I money had to be highly qualified, meaning that they had to have a bachelor's degree in the subject they were teaching and state certification. Additionally, states were to ensure that highly qualified teachers were evenly distributed between schools with high concentrations of poverty and wealthier schools. This extensive level of accountability was unprecedented, as no other reauthorization of the 1965 ESEA dictated this level of responsibility for academic results. Before we move on to choice, I just want to talk about some of the criticisms surrounding these increased accountability measures, which is coming mostly from conversations I've had with teachers during my time as a paraprofessional for the NYC DOE and as a substitute teacher in charter and private schools. They all agree for the most part that this disaggregation of test results was beneficial in that it highlighted achievement gaps and forced focus on bolstering the academic achievement of students who were strategically undervalued. But the buck stops there. Testing was a huge problem because teachers' pay and schools' resources were tied to if students passed tests, so that instructors no longer provided a full and robust educational experience, but instead taught to the test, essentially narrowing the curriculum. And these tests set up benchmarks that only recognize student achievement if they could meet those benchmarks. It was highly controversial because, for example, if the test demanded that a third grade reader be here by the end of third grade, but came in on a first grade reading level, worked really hard with this teacher, did his homework, demonstrated that learning was happening, but only tested on a second grade reading level during that annual test, that academic growth was dismissed. Worse yet, if that same student works really, really hard, got a tutor and other outside help, but tested just a hair below the benchmark on that annual test, that academic growth was too dismissed. And again, threatened the schools and teachers' financial resources. All in all, testing did not consider the whole student and became demoralizing to teachers and students alike. The second hallmark feature of No Child Left Behind was increased choice, which Dr. Stolinga will discuss further.
The second thing that the No Child Left Behind Act focused on is increased choice, and particularly focused again on Title I schools or schools that receive Title I money. This is a really important part of understanding this legislation, that the federal government is really legislating around schools and localities that are receiving federal funds. So this applies differentially to different schools and districts because some are receiving more Title I funds than others depending on their student population. But essentially what this legislation said is that if your school isn't making the appropriate progress, or if your school is exceptionally unsafe, then districts and states have to allow students to seek other options in terms of schools, and have the option to go to a higher performing or safer school. And it set up benchmarks for that, essentially saying if your school doesn't make progress in 3 out of 4 years on these adequate yearly progress markers, then it's the case that we have to open up schools in other parts of the district that are higher performing or safer in order for students in these schools to take those seats. I think one of the things we need to understand is the number of eligible or open seats that are actually available for students who are in these unsafe or low-performing schools, and how many students were actually eligible to take those seats. There's a very difficult balance, and lots of students were eligible to move and not many seats were available. The other two pieces that are important in terms of increased choice for parents and students is that the No Child Left Behind Act specified that for students that weren't making adequate progress, or for schools that weren't making adequate progress, districts had to release resources for students to go and seek supplemental supports. Usually this was in the form of tutoring supports, but there were many kinds of programs that students were actually given sort of vouchers in order to go get additional supports. At the end of the continuum in terms of choice was a stipulation in the legislation that said if schools were perpetually failing, that eventually these schools would be reconstituted or sort of intervened in a deeper way. So over the course of the 12 years towards adequate yearly progress, schools received deeper and deeper interventions if they weren't meeting those results.
The next foundational element of NCLB is increased flexibility. No Child Left Behind set aside money to establish charter schools to compete with traditional schools. It provided freedom from many state regulations, allowing more flexibility in meeting the educational objectives established by the law. In fact, charter schools were granted additional flexibility in the area of curriculum, the length of the school year or school day, and in most states did not have to deal with teacher unions. In public schools, the No Child Left Behind Act attempted to incentivize districts to meet its strict accountability measures by offering more flexibility in the use of federal funds. For example, federal funding streams such as the Teacher Quality State Grant or innovative programs could be collapsed into Title I to be used for less stringent purposes. However, public school districts did not utilize these flexibility programs because there was already adequate flexibility without the programs, or because the amount of funds offered was too small to make it worthwhile. And finally, there was simply a lack of information about the programs, according to Gail Christensen in an article entitled Evaluation of Flexibility under No Child Left Behind, volumes 1 through 4 for urban.org. The final foundational element of NCLB was early intervention through a program called Reading First. The Reading First grant program essentially allocated federal dollars to target K through 3rd grade learners who are at risk of falling behind grade level in language arts or literacy. NCLB demanded from the states and districts that were awarded said funds to establish scientific and research-based approaches for the determination and intervention of young and struggling readers. Additionally, the legislation outlined the specific activities states, districts, and school grantees were to carry out based upon said research. According to a major federal study of the program, participating schools spent a significant amount of time teaching the basic skills researchers insisted children needed to become more proficient readers, and still, the $1 billion a year Reading First program had no measurable effect on students' reading comprehension. I just reviewed 4 hallmark features of NCLB and some of the major criticisms, implications, or ramifications surrounding them. So let's get into these final thoughts. What researching NCLB has left me wondering is how we might close achievement gaps based on immutable identity markers like sex or race, and even in theory, the more fluid ones like economic status. Here's what we know. Progressive schools that center students and their interests produce more socially and academically advanced individuals compared to schools that rely on theories of scientific management and outcomes based on standardized tests, which is well documented in Ralph Tyler's 1930s 8-year study. Further, the desegregation and integration of schools improves the academic achievement of all learners. By 1988, school integration in the United States had reached its peak, and the achievement gap between Black and white students was at its lowest point since the government began collecting data. The difference in Black and white reading scores fell to half what it was in 1971, according to data from the National Center for Education Statistics. As schools have since resegregated, the test score gap has only grown. The improvements for Black children did not come at the cost of white children. As Black test scores rose, so did white ones. Decades of studies affirm integration's power. It's a fact. We are falling behind academically on the international stage. For example, in 2013, 29 other nations outperformed the U.S. in mathematics, and 19 other nations outperformed the U.S. in reading. I believe that essential to our improving Our ranking on the global stage is the removal of economic, racial, sexist, and all other systemic barriers that perpetrate unbalanced, unequal, and unfair social and academic outcomes at home. And that those billions of dollars that we invest in experimental programs should be invested in implementing and improving programs we know work, like progressive education, and/or the desegregation and integration of U.S. schools. I hope you have learned something new about Bush's 2001 No Child Left Behind Act, and that I've left you with something to think about with regards to education reform. Thank you.